Welcome to Struggles of the Spirit. I'm your host, the Reverend Lee Udell, and I'm glad you have chosen to be with us this morning for an hour. We look at all kinds of subjects related to one's spiritual life, or in this case, particularly today, the spiritual life of other creatures, more than just human beings. And I think you're going to find this a kind of a fascinating thing to consider. Remember, this is a phone-in show, and so we want your thoughts, your responses, your ideas as we go along. Interrupt us at any level whenever you wish, and we welcome that. Our phone-in number is 264-2255, 264-2255. I'll invite you again during the program to phone in, but please don't be bashful. We really covet your call. I have with us today the Reverend Gary Kowalski. He's the pastor at the Unitarian Universalist Society in Burlington, at the head of Church Street. If you stand on Church Street and you look north at the end of Church Street on the other side of Pearl, there is the Unitarian Universalist Society, a beautiful building with a marvelous spire, and it's a fascinating place. And so Gary is here to talk about a major interest of his, and he's written some books on the subject. He hasn't just talked about it in sermons or in articles, but he's actually written some books around the subject of the other kind of creatures on this earth besides human beings, animals. And I guess, Gary, how far do you, is it just mammals you're interested in?
Well, no.
More than mammals.
No, I'm interested in all of the other creatures who share this planet with us, primarily animals, primarily those who are sentient, who have some awareness in inner life, are cognizant of their surroundings, have perhaps an emotional sensitivity as we do. And who's to say how far that circle extends, or how far down the ladder of simplicity or complexity self-awareness might go. But my strong feeling is that in the past we've drawn the circle far too narrowly, and we've put ourselves on top of the ladder and failed to consider those who are on other rungs, not below us perhaps, but just to the side, who are also sharing in, as you call it, struggles of the spirit.
Could I ask you to, if it fits for your own thought processes, to tell our viewers a little bit about how you became interested in this whole subject?
Well, absolutely. It's a good question, because most of us, particularly most religious folk who find our rootings in the Jewish or Christian tradition, don't give too much thought to other creatures. Our Western religious lineage has been mostly human-centered. It's the transaction, the drama that transpires between man and God that's central, that's foremost. Well, recently we've been expanding our understanding of man to mean not exclusively male. It certainly includes women. It certainly includes human beings of all races and ages, but few of us have considered that God's concern might extend to species other than our own. And I was part of that group. I don't think I really gave too much thought as a religious person to mammals or birds or fish or reptiles. There was a defining moment for me back in the mid-'80s. I think it was 1985. I was serving a church on the West Coast and was driving into a meeting one night. I think it was in February, a somewhat dreary cold winter evening when I turned on the radio in my car and heard the story that I think is now fairly well known about Coco and her kitten. Coco is a female lowland gorilla. Even at that time, she'd been part of the world's longest ongoing ape language experiment. Her trainer, Penny Patterson, out at the Gorilla Foundation in Woodside, California, had instructed Coco in the use of about 500 signs in American Sign Language, and she'd become fluent. She'd even asked for a special gift for her birthday. She wanted a kitten. I guess she enjoyed picture books, and one of her favorite books was Puss in Boots. So she said, I want a kitten. And she received a kitten, a little tailless ball of fur that for some reason Coco named All Ball. And the story goes that Coco and the kitten very quickly bonded. We're not the only species who have pets or form affectionate connections with those outside our own species. Coco carried the kitten about tucked up against her upper thigh the way a mother gorilla will carry her infant. She would play chasing and tickling games with the kitten, but she quickly discovered that kittens do have teeth, they do bite, and when that happened, Coco would make her expressions of disapproval, dirty cat, toilet, and so forth, but then they were quickly made friends again and were having a gay old time until one evening somehow the cat escaped from the compound where the two lived and was hit by a car.
Oh.
Yes, and the staff had to tell Coco what had happened. The kitten's gone, the kitten's dead, won't be coming back. And Coco first acted as though she hadn't heard or hadn't understood. There was no reaction at all.
Just denial in human
denial.
terms.
Now, Lee, you've worked in a hospital. You're familiar with the grieving process.
Oh, yes, very, very, very familiar.
That's a common reaction.
That's the first one. I don't believe it.
Disbelief.
I don't believe it until I see my beloved Coco.
Right. Complete shock. Numbness.
Right.
And it took a few minutes for the news to begin to sink in, and then Coco began to cry and to moan and whimper softly to herself, and for days afterward would continue to be visibly upset whenever the subject of cats was mentioned. She was grieving the way you or I might grieve if our kitten were struck by a car. What made this most remarkable was that Maureen Sheehan, another of the staffers at the Gorilla Foundation, was able to speak with Coco a bit to help explore how much she understood of what had happened. And Maureen asked Coco, why do gorillas die?
Wow.
Now,
that's a profound question.
Well, that's a profound question. Why does anybody die?
Absolutely.
That is in some ways the central religious question that every faith tradition struggles with.
Right.
Why do people die? Why do any of us die?
Why does God allow that to happen?
Right. So Coco was asked the question, why do gorillas die? And she made the signs for trouble and old. And Coco was then asked, where do gorillas go when they die?
I love it. I love it.
That's also a question that clergy of every tradition ask, that scriptures of every faith has to address.
And children ask about their pets.
Where do we go? What happens to us? Is there anything beyond this life? So Coco was asked, where do gorillas go when they die? And she made the signs for comfortable, a hole, like a hole in the ground, and then the sign for goodbye, which is touching your fingers to your lips and kissing goodbye.
Mm.
And finally, Maureen asked Coco, how do gorillas feel when they die? Are they happy, sad, afraid? And Coco made the sign for sleep. I heard this story on the radio. It's common now. Many other people have heard it, but it hit me with the force of a revelation. I'd been a practicing minister at that point for some years. I'd helped people plan memorial services for their loved ones. I understood the emotional dynamics of bereavement, or thought I did,
Mm-hmm.
and yet it had never occurred to me that other species might approach death with some of the same feelings and questions that we do.
So when you heard all of this about Coco and Coco's grief, then the whole issue of the interior life of animals.
Well, yes, and that whole topic opened up to me not only as an intellectual horizon that I'd never considered before, but it also struck me with the force of emotional insight. It just so happened that at that time I'd lost my grandfather a few weeks before. He was the primary father figure for me as I was growing up, and even though I was a minister ordained, even though I was the professional who was supposed to have the answers to these questions of why do people die, where do we go when we die, how are we supposed to feel when we die, I didn't have any of those answers. I was struggling with it the way we all struggle when we lose a loved one. And yet, somehow, Coco's story was a tremendously healing story for me. I felt this great sensation of companionship, of being befriended, accompanied through this loss, that I didn't have to bear it alone. I realized that my grandfather's story and my story of birth, of death, of the turning of the generations, of aging and new life, isn't just my little tiny drama. It doesn't just concern my family, me and my grandfather. It's the human story, and it's much broader than even the human story. It's the story that's been going on for billions of years on our planet. And we're all participants in this wondrous process of dissolution and renewal, of loss and the rebirth of hope. A few weeks later, I had to preach an Easter sermon, Lee. Now, sometimes Easter's a struggle for me, but that year, for some reason, it wasn't. I felt that...
What made it less a struggle?
Well, because of this experience of knowing about Coco and learning the rest of the story, that after she had grieved for her kitten, Coco was able to eventually move on and adopt another cat.
Huh?
And I thought, well, all right, good for Coco. If she can do it, so can I. You know, I think Coco's very articulate for an ape, maybe perhaps more articulate than I am as a preacher sometimes.
I haven't known many apes, I'm afraid.
Well, but you know, I think that Easter Coco, if she had been in the pulpit, she would have been saying, Happy Easter, hallelujah, O death, where is thy sting? That's the best I can do to explain it, Lee. I think these...
It helps a lot.
These spiritual journeys, they take turnings that can't fully be rationally explained, but that was a turning point for me. And of course, then I began to wonder, well, is this just an isolated incident, or is there more to this? And that was really the genesis of my first book, The Souls of Animals, which asks the question of the extent to which other species share in those qualities that we usually think of as being uniquely human, soulful, spiritual. Are animals like us aware of death? Do they experience grief? Do they struggle with that? Are animals like us aesthetic beings? Do they create art? Do they make music? Do they appreciate beauty? Do they have a moral sense, a feeling of right and wrong? Do they fantasize, dream, play? How similar are we really, and how different?
Let me ask you a question that came up in my thinking as I listened to you talk about Coco. How does one communicate on this inner level? I mean, you said Coco would respond in intelligent ways to questions about it, the animal's grief and coping mechanisms. How do you do that? Most of us, we have a dog or we have a cat. I mean, there are exotic in this part of the world other animals, but most of us are familiar with dogs or cats, and we know that they look quizzical. I mean, if I'm packing to go away for several days, my dog knows I'm leaving. And,
I think so, yes.
They see the suitcase, they know what that means.
There's some anxiety.
The anxiety, what's going to happen to me, and I like you, and I love you, and you're very much part of my world, and I'm bonded to you, and you see that. But
right.
But I don't ask my dog questions and get answers. How does that work?
No, someone recently wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, and the whole point was that there are more than one dimension to being a sapient and intellectual thinking creature. And it's not only the ability to solve logical problems or do mathematical equations or handle complicated sentence structures that makes us thinking beings. Emotional intelligence includes that ability to intuit and understand what another person is feeling. Some people have it and some people don't, but I think many animals possess it in high degree. I think probably dogs, many dogs have more emotional intelligence, are better grounded in their feelings than some people are. But how do we get into an animal's inner life, what they're thinking about?
Yeah.
Well, some of it's inferential because we can't ask as directly as we do with our own kind. But, to take the question of are animals aware of death? When I began to investigate this more, it became clear that this was an attribute that was shared by many other creatures. Cynthia Moss is a woman who's done research with elephants in Africa for many years. And she talks about the fascination that elephants have with the skeletons of their own kind.
Really?
Yes, it happens from time to time that a family group of elephants will come across a skeleton or a skull of another pachyderm.
With the flesh all gone?
Usually. Invariably, though, they stop to inspect that skeleton and to particularly to feel the skull with their trunk, which is an incredibly sensitive appendage. There are something like 200 separate muscles in an elephant's trunk. It's far more sensitive, far more dexterous than the fingers on our own hand. To feel the skull, perhaps, one might guess, is this an effort to identify the individual that's died, or to ask what's happened here? Frequently they'll pick up the bones and carry them from place to place as though trying to find a suitable resting place for the remains. The story that really shook me, though, was when she told about a family group that lived on the Amboseli Reserve in Kenya. Now, elephants do live in stable families, in social organizations that are a little different than ours. Usually it's the females who live together. The males, the bulls, will go off and do their own thing, but the
boys will be boys.
The boys will be boys.
Excuse me.
In elephants as in other species. But these family groupings last a lifetime, and elephants live as long as we do, so these loyalties they develop are long-lived. Somehow, the particular family that Cynthia Moss was studying had wandered off the safety of the game reserve and had been attacked by hunters or poachers who managed to shoot one of the young females. This was an adolescent, about 15 years old. Shot her in the chest, and the blood just began to pour out of the wound, and all the family members immediately gathered round to see what they could possibly do to help.
Was the hunter still there?
Doesn't say. This is just what Moss observed. The wounded elephant began to stagger, and immediately her mother, Trista, and another relative, an aunt named Teresia, came to each side of the wounded animal and leaned their weight in against her so that they were trying to support her, to put their shoulders underneath her to keep her on her feet, perhaps to walk her back to safety. Unable to do that, the wound was too serious. Finally, the animal collapsed, and members of the family group went into the brush. Some gathered grass and tried to put grass into the elephant's mouth to feed her, to provide nourishment. Her mother, Trista, put her tusks underneath her daughter's form and tried to lift her off the ground, again to carry her to safety. The weight was too heavy. The tusk broke, and the tusk is a living appendage, so it was just a bloody stump left there. Finally, they knew it was hopeless and gave up the ghost. The family didn't abandon the body, though. They went into the forest. They brought back brush and began to cover the lifeless form of the elephant with vegetation. They scooped up dirt and covered the form with dirt. Elephant burials are very common, Moss has found. This is well known among zoologists now. The family didn't leave. They stayed with their fallen child all through the night, kept vigil. Finally, as the sun was coming up, they turned to go back to the safety of the Ambaselli Reserve, but it was her mother who was the last to go. Now again, I've done funerals, as you have, and you've been at the grave site, and the body is placed into the grave or the container. Sometimes there are flowers or other mementos placed into the grave site. The prayers are said. And yet even after everything's been said, everything's been done that can be done, the family doesn't want to go.
Right.
They stay there. They can't quite tear themselves away. It's too hard to make that final goodbye. And I don't think it's a great leap or a tremendous conjecture to say that these elephants are experiencing some of the same emotions that a human family feels when they're at the graveside saying goodbye to one of their departed loved ones. There's this great sense of loss and sadness and bereavement that goes with that. And Moss certainly confirms that. She says that mothers who have lost their children will at least appear to be depressed, lethargic, loss of appetite for days, weeks, months after they've lost a child. Happens in other species too. Conrad Lorenz is one of the great names in animal science. You know, it was Lorenz who spent his life studying birds primarily and discovered this whole phenomenon of imprinting, how a baby chick will hatch out of the shell and then become imprinted, stamped with the image of the first thing it sees. And if that's usually its mother, that's great. But if it's a zoologist like Lorenz, then they follow Lorenz wherever he may go. But with the geese he studied, geese, like some other bird species, mate for life. One of the birds lost its partner. It was eaten by a fox, and the remaining spouse, so to speak, showed all the signs of grief. Drooping head, eyes cast down, loss of appetite. Now, if you saw those signs in someone in the hospital, someone that you were ministering to, counseling, you wouldn't need words to understand how they were feeling. Words would be completely inadequate, I think. So I think we can gain a sense of what's happening with other species.
Let me interrupt for a moment and encourage our viewers to phone in. You're hearing our subject today about the life of creatures other than human beings, and their feelings, their emotions, their reactions to the world around them, which we, generally speaking, completely ignore. And our guest, the Reverend Gary Kowalski, is teaching us about these other creatures who share the planet with us. Please call us. Our phone number is 264-2255. 264-2255. We'd like to hear your experiences about your cat, your dog, your horse, whatever animal and creature that you have come to know and have had a relationship with, and how you communicate with that creature, and how the creature communicates with you. A graphic example of one negative communication. My wife had a friend who had a cat, and the cat somehow was being there was some event going on in the life of the owner of the cat that was displeasing the cat, and the cat knew that the owner's bedroom slippers were a very cherished possession. The cat went and very artfully left a feces right inside the slipper.
And I don't think that was a coincidence.
No, that was no coincidence at all. Very, very conceived and carried out.
You didn't have to be psychic to understand that communication.
No way.
Either,
no way. No, that was very, very crystal clear.
Yeah. You know, it's been a minority of thinkers within our religious traditions who've been concerned with animals, but there have been some. Martin Buber,
oh yes,
was one.
And tell our viewers about I, thou, that aspect about him, because that's what he's famous for.
Yes, Martin Buber is a tremendously influential philosopher and theologian of the 20th century, influential both within Jewish and Christian circles. His most famous work was the book I and Thou, which states that it is in our meeting, in our intimate connection, our recognition of each other as independent beings, and yet also beings who share a common bond of feeling, that we come closest to the heart of the religious life. It's there in those encounters that we discover the realm of the spirit. But for Buber, that original discovery of the importance of the I-thou relationship came about through animals. In his
Really?
yes,
I didn't know that
yes,
part.
in his biography, he says, his autobiography. No, I guess it's a biography, but he was about 11 years old and in the habit of visiting his uncle's farm. And one of his favorite pastimes there was to go into the big barn where there was a gray mare who lived there, and he would spend time with this animal, talking with the horse, petting it. He felt a special kinship and affinity with this animal. And he says that it was, as he stroked this massive body and felt the aliveness of this other being underneath his hand, that he came into awareness of this this mystery that meets us on the boundary between the self and the other. And he wrote about that in his book, I and Now. He said that even the eyes of a house cat hold a question, or at least held a question for him. When he looked at a cat, it wasn't just a thing, just an object. He would look into the cat's eyes, and the cat seemed to be asking, do you mean me? Do you actually recognize me? Do I exist for you? Am I not just a plaything to perform tricks for you or to amuse you? So that was the defining incident that for him led to a lifetime of work.
T.S. Eliot's book on cats,
Yes.
he sort of infers that the cat knows its own real name,
Right.
and we don't. We give it a name that we think is right, and sometimes it seems to fit, maybe, but the real name of the cat is the cat's secret.
I think so. Animals have a secret life, and certainly they have a life that's independent of our own, independent of our pleasures or uses or plans for them. Once you start thinking about animals in this new light as beings who are so much like ourselves in their ability to experience the world, the heights and the depths, to experience grief and beauty and love and creativity, then you also have to begin asking a whole set of ethical questions about how we treat other beings. And we don't treat them very well, by and large.
No.
I wrote my most recent book, The Bible According to Noah, in part to begin to correct this attitude. Our religious tradition has enforced the assumption that animals are there for us. They're food, they're research tools, maybe they sometimes entertain us, but they have no real value in and of themselves, and that needs to be challenged, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we could go a bit further in what you're saying, Gary. We don't treat all human beings the same either. You know.
No.
It's not just animals. You know.
No, and when we treat them particularly poorly, we say, you're treating them like an animal.
Yes, ethnic cleansing, you know?
That's right.
I mean, so with the human creature is not a very admirable creature sometimes.
No, we're not very admirable even compared to other species. When you look at our capacity for cruelty, for savagery, for dastardly behavior. We don't always measure up very well. In the Bible, according to Noah, I talk about an experiment that was done about 30 years ago with rhesus monkeys. Macaques, a pair of researchers were hoping to explore the phenomenon of altruism in the animal world. Altruism being doing good deeds for other, charitable behavior, extending yourself compassionately to others. And the way they approached this was to take a monkey and to put the monkey in a restraining chair with buckles over the arms and around the middle so that the monkey couldn't move, but the monkey could pull a chain when it saw a light flashing, and if it pulled the chain at the right time and the right moment, it would receive its ration of food and be rewarded in that way. Well, once they'd taught the monkey this rather simple task, they introduced a new element into the experiment. They put another animal, another rhesus monkey, in another chair. Again, restraining buckles over the arms. The animal couldn't escape. And now every time the first monkey would pull the chain to get its food, the other monkey would get a shock and be in visible agony. What the scientists said they were studying was the effect of genetic kinship and altruism. Would it make a difference whether that other animal was related, a cousin or an uncle or a nephew, in determining whether or not they would be spared the shock? Well, I wonder about the experimenters, the technicians who designed these kinds of experiments.
Vicious, I think.
Well, why are we exploring this? What does it really tell us about ourselves? Well, interestingly, it did tell us something unexpected about the animals. Almost all of the monkeys turned out to be conscientious objectors. They would not go along with this experimental paradigm. 87% of the monkeys refused to pull the chain, refused to shock the other animal. One monkey went without food for 12 days. I mean, that's
my goodness.
That's to the point of starvation, rather than intentionally inflict injury on this other creature that's helpless to resist. And they found that it made no difference at all whether this monkey was a brother or a sister or genetically kin. There was only one thing that made a difference. Did this animal who was pulling the chain, had he or she ever had to sit in that other seat himself?
That made a difference?
Yes. If that monkey had been on the receiving end of shocks, if they knew what it felt like, they were very unlikely to inflict that kind of suffering on their neighbor.
Well, my goodness.
Well, yeah, it makes you think of that parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yes,
And you ask,
yes,
who
yes.
is my neighbor?
Who is my neighbor?
Gee, I think if it were being retold today, our sense of, Jesus was trying to expand our sense of who our neighbor is from beyond those who were just of the chosen people, the Israelites, to the Samaritans, who at that time were an outcast, despised, disregarded people. I think today he might be urging us to expand our concept of the neighbor beyond the reaches of our own species. I mean, chimpanzees have over 99% of their DNA in common with human beings.
Wow.
And yet, if Coco were here today, if you were interviewing Coco, or if you were interviewing Washoe, or one of the chimpanzees who was able to communicate through sign or in some other way, this would be a very different situation. We assume that because we're sitting here, Lee, we're both equals, right? Our political philosophy tells us that we're endowed with inalienable rights because we're human, but Coco
Suppose we had Coco
and
sitting here
Washoe
in a chair.
don't have any rights. Our economic philosophers tell us that you and I, because we're human, we can possess private property. But animals can't do that. They are property. They're bought and sold. And our religious traditions tell us that you and I have immortal souls because we're human, but these animals who behave and respond very much as we do are said to have no souls. Now
yes.
we need to look at all that.
And we humans used to buy and sell human slaves.
That's exactly right.
We Christian groups.
It's an exact parallel. Down at the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, when that museum was founded 300 years ago, in the beginning, they not only had stuffed animals, the hides of exotic creatures in their display cases, they also had a tanned Negro hide. Now, isn't that disgusting? Isn't that a horror show? The museum burned. They lost that collection, but you can still see, hundreds of stuffed animals there. We wouldn't think of stuffing a human being and putting them on display, but why do we stuff other creatures? Take their lives, take them away, take them out of the wild, take them away from their families, to put under glass.
I'm waiting for some phone calls. I think our guest Gary Kowalski is asking us to respond. I think I'm certainly responding. I mean, we perhaps the animals are a much greater form of creation than we humans, because their heart is more right somehow. They're more than ours.
Well, Mark Twain called them the higher animals.
He did.
Yes, he said man is the only animal that blushes or has need to, and many others have pointed out that in some ways animals are much more attuned to the divine than we are. They're wild, they're innocent, they live in the moment. They're not consumed with acquisitiveness or the accumulation of possessions or money. There's no species besides ants and human beings that wage war or that kill needlessly for sport or amusement. In many ways, animals are teachers and models that we can learn from.
I think this is true. You're obviously learned on the subject. I am not. I've always understood that if two wolves are fighting for control of the pack, or two moose are fighting, or elk are fighting for that, as soon as it becomes clear that one is going to win and could gore or rip out the throat of the other, when it's obvious, then the one who has the ascendancy doesn't kill. They just say, "Okay, you got the message," and they just
right. It's only the human species that fights
to the death.
Duels to the death out of a misguided sense of honor or bravado or machismo. I mean,
well, you're familiar.
We're the alpha males here.
I'm sure you're familiar with the alpha position with the dog.
Yeah.
And if you turn, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're having trouble with your dog behaving, if you turn the dog over on its back, so his or her throat is bared, you might say, and they're at your mercy. They know they've got to behave.
Many dog trainers recommend this, and I'm not an expert in dog training. I've used the technique myself, but I think if it's applied, it needs to be done lovingly.
Yes.
I don't think the dog should be hurled about onto its back.
No.
But that is a common technique. Now let me say a word about my other book, Goodbye Friend, Healing Wisdom for Anyone Who Ever Lost a Pet, if I may, Lee.
Sure. And please, we're waiting for your phone calls. Call us. We're not raising money today. We're not doing that. We're asking you for your input. So our phone number here is, now I'm suddenly my eyes aren't focusing.
It's 264-2255.
Thank you. Go ahead. Tell us about this new book.
Well, Goodbye Friend is a book for people who've lost their animal companions. It fills a need, I think, that I became aware of some years ago. As a minister, I discovered that from time to time people would come to me seeking, I don't know if you'd want to say counseling, but some kind of comfort or moral support.
Help, certainly.
Yeah, help. A pastoral word, a caring word, a kind word when their animals would go. Because until very recently, this loss was so minimized, so disregarded. You might spend 12 or 15 years of your life with a dog, more with a cat, even more with a horse. And yet, when the animal would die, it would go unacknowledged. Of course, there are no
rituals.
There are no rituals that accompany it. There's no support to speak of that happens within the religious community. A few years ago, a woman in my congregation approached me and she asked me if I would share on Sunday morning in our joys and concerns that her dog, Oatmeal, had died the previous week. And I had to think, well, is this appropriate? And finally I said, well, yes. And I did share it, and it made such a difference to her just to have the loss acknowledged, that this is something that hurts, whether your friend has 2 legs or 4 legs. A
loss is a loss is a loss.
The grief is just the same. And in some cases, it can be even more intense. Right. One of the stories I tell in here is about Iris Muggenthaler. Some people know Iris. She lives in Charlotte. She's the head of InTrap, which is our statewide organization to ban the leg-hold trap. She's had animals all her life, but probably her forever animal was a horse that she named Sentimental Journey. She got the horse when she was 16, just as she was in those formative coming-of-age years, and she had the horse into her mid-40s for 30 years.
Bye.
Now with the animal, every day you walk the animal, you exercise it, feed, water, grooming. A horse needs daily care, and it's tactile.
Yep.
I have to say, I can't say that every single day I hug my kids. I wish I did. I try to. But every day your hands are on that horse. And she said it's just a visceral bond that is so powerful. She didn't want to minimize the loss of her parents or the other human losses in her life, but she said when Sentimental Journey died, it was just something that had an edge to it that none of those other losses possessed. So I think what I've tried to do with this book is first of all to acknowledge the magnitude, the seriousness of the grief and the importance of those bonds that we have with our animals.
And there have been some studies that show older people, particularly who maybe are housebound, do much better living with their confinement, their limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
To have a pet.
People who have pets have a lower incidence of heart disease, are less susceptible to cancer, have less chronic illness, longer lifespans.
That's a fact. It's a belief.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's been shown that just stroking a pet, a cat or a dog, or even looking at fish in an aquarium will have an immediate effect on your pulse rate and blood pressure. It's like meditation. And of course this is why therapy dogs have become so common in therapeutic settings, old age homes, hospitals. Last year we had the director of Therapy Dogs of Vermont come to our church to present a program, and he told some amazing stories. They take the dogs mainly into the pediatric wards. There was a girl in one of the wards who had been in a coma for several days, head injured, no response to outside stimulus. Her mother had been sitting with her daughter and left to go get a cup of coffee and a snack when the therapy dogs came in. And the therapy dog got up on the bed, crawled up on the girl's chest. She was lying there, no movement, no indication that there was any awareness. And this dog got on her chest, you know, and started to nuzzle her and lick her face. And the arms just came up and around the dog. And when her mother came back into the room, she was sitting up and talking. Now, you know, that's
a miracle.
Well, it is a miracle. When I say a miracle, I don't mean anything supernatural. I mean it
was unexpected.
It's beautiful. It's something that
it's a holy experience.
It's something that
it's life responding to life.
Brain surgeons can't understand it. Certainly can't replicate it. It's just the power and possibility of life and of love. And a dog is unconditional love in one of its purest and noblest forms, and we respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I guess I want to.
I'm thinking of the Charles Schulz cartoon. Linus is musing philosophically, meditatively, asking himself, why is it that some of us are born as human beings and others of us are fated to be born as dogs? And Snoopy's overhearing his conversation and thinks to himself, well, we can't all be lucky.
Well, would you say something about the common, at least Christian reading of Scripture about having that in creation that God wants humans to have dominion over all the other non-human creatures? What does that mean, and how has it been understood in the past, and how would you see it understood in the future?
Well, the first chapter of Genesis is one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, although it has been misinterpreted through the centuries, because after God finishes the creation, God creates women and men in the divine images and says, now you have dominion over the other creatures of the earth. Some people have interpreted that to mean that other creatures are ours to exploit and to abuse. Well, I don't think that's what it meant to the original Hebrew authors. Human beings are to have dominion over the earth in the sense of stewardship, protection, of responsible care, the way that a
parent and child?
A parent has dominion over a child, the way that we, for better or worse, have dominion over our cats and dogs. This doesn't mean that we we abuse these animals, it means they're put into our care as a lifelong responsibility. And I'm sure that this is also the intent of the scripture. You know, people forget about what happens in the first chapter of Genesis before we get around to the creation of human beings. Well, there's a lot of God's work that happens before He ever thinks about men and women.
The majority of it.
Yes, yes. The animals are created. Yes. The fish, those that fly through the air, the cattle of the earth, those that creep and crawl. There are at least 2 whole days of creation given to the other living animals, only 1 given to the human beings. And God looks upon these animals as God looks upon the sun and the moon and the firmament and says, "This is good." Now these animals, as a matter of fact, were here for hundreds of millions of years before Homo sapiens arrived on the planet. They were part of the creation, part of God's plan, long before evolution tried the experiment of humankind. And they are good. It's a rich, beautiful, diverse creation that God has given us. And our job as latecomers, as younger siblings in the family of life, is to use the powers that have been given us to promote, protect, and cherish and safeguard life, not to bring it to destruction. So by acting in this way, I think we will not only save other species, not only perpetuate the life of the planet, we will also come to a true understanding of who we are, of who we're meant to be. We will come into a place of peace, of shalom with ourselves and the other creatures, because the Hebrew creatures clearly say in the beginning, in the garden, we were all in a state of oneness. There was communion between us. Mm-hmm. They also point to the end of time, when the lion and the lamb will lie down together and the little child will lead them. I think that each time we reach out with our heart and our mind and compassion to another being, we're taking another step on that road towards shalom, toward the realm of God.
I like that, Gary. We probably have only 2 minutes left. Let me just sum up with at least as to who you are. We've been listening and talking and thinking with the Reverend Gary Kowalski. He's the pastor at the Unitarian Universalist Society here in Burlington, and he's been talking with us about the other creatures in this world beyond that of human beings and our relationship with these creatures. Now, do you want to sum up in a short, very short compass? The music is starting here.
Well, let me just mention that if people want to explore these ideas in greater depth, all of these books are available over Amazon.com. You can order them through Borders or Barnes & Noble or other local bookstores. The Souls of Animals and Goodbye Friend are also available through the One Spirit and Quality Paperback Book Club.
Under Gary Kowalski.
Under Gary Kowalski. And I appreciate you inviting me to be a guest on your show, Lee. I hope that this will be the beginning of a discussion and not the end for all of us who are committed people of faith.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. It's been good. Enjoyed it.